The scream pierced through the humid afternoon air like a knife through silence, followed immediately by the sound of retching and children crying. I dropped my field testing kit and sprinted toward the residential street where moments before, 3 young children had been cheerfully selling lemonade from a bright yellow stand, decorated with hand-drawn rainbows. 8-year-old Marcus was doubled over behind the stand, his small body convulsing as his stomach emptied violently onto the pristine sidewalk. His sister, Amara, barely 6, sat crying in the grass, clutching her belly and calling for their mother. Their friend Jamal had made it only a few feet before collapsing to his knees, his dark skin pale with distress. "What happened?" I demanded, pulling out my phone to call emergency services while simultaneously reaching for my CDC identification badge. 20 years as a field inspector had taught me to recognize potential chemical exposure when I saw it. Mrs. Johnson, the children's mother, came running from the house, her work apron still tied around her waist. "They were fine 5 minutes ago. They just had some of their own lemonade and—" Her voice broke as she knelt beside Marcus, her hands shaking as she tried to comfort him. I surveyed the scene with trained eyes. 3 plastic cups sat on the small table, each containing about an inch of what appeared to be ordinary pink lemonade. The children's pitcher was nearly empty, suggesting they'd been successful in their little business venture. But something was wrong. The liquid in the cups had an oily sheen that natural lemonade shouldn't possess. "Dr. Sarah Chen, CDC, I announced, showing my badge. "I need everyone to step back from the stand. This could be contamination." I pulled on latex gloves and carefully lifted one of the cups, noting the strange smell citrus mixed with something artificial and medicinal. The ambulance arrived within minutes, paramedics quickly assessing the children and loading them onto stretchers. Marcus had stopped vomiting, but was severely dehydrated. Amara's crying had subsided into quiet whimpers, and Jamal seemed to be recovering slightly, but was still too weak to stand. "Food poisoning, most likely," the lead paramedic told Mrs. Johnson. "We'll need to pump their stomachs and run some tests." But I wasn't convinced. In my experience, food poisoning didn't present this suddenly or this severely in children who had been fine moments before. I carefully sealed the remaining cups in evidence bags and took samples of the lemonade from the pitcher. As the ambulance pulled away, Mrs. Johnson tearfully explaining to her husband over the phone what had happened. I noticed movement in the house across the street. A woman in her 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair, was standing at her window, watching the scene with what appeared to be satisfaction rather than concern. Something cold settled in my stomach. 3 hours earlier, the Maple Grove subdivision had been picture-perfect in its late summer tranquility. Neat lawns stretched like green carpets between identical colonial-style homes, each one conforming to the strict HOA guidelines that governed everything from mailbox colors to acceptable holiday decorations. I had been conducting routine water quality tests in the area, following up on reports of unusual algae blooms in the community pond. The Johnson family's house sat at the corner of Elm and Maple, a modest 2-story with cheerful yellow shutters that, I would later learn, were exactly 1 shade brighter than the HOA's approved color palette. Mrs. Evelyn Pritchard, the HOA president, had made her displeasure known about this violation on multiple occasions. I had first noticed the lemonade stand around noon while taking water samples from the storm drain near their property. Marcus, Amara, and Jamal had been busy setting up their little enterprise, carefully arranging cookies their mother had helped them bake and filling a large pitcher with pink lemonade. Their excitement was infectious. They chattered about using their earnings to buy supplies for their upcoming school art project. "Lemonade, fresh lemonade. Only 50 cents. Marcus had called out in his clear young voice, waving enthusiastically at passing cars. The children had clearly put effort into their presentation, with hand-painted signs and even a small chalkboard listing their prices. I had purchased a cup, more to encourage their entrepreneurial spirit than out of thirst. The lemonade was perfectly ordinary sweet, tart, with just enough real lemon to avoid tasting artificial. The children beamed when I complimented their recipe and told them they were natural business people. Around 1 o'clock, I'd noticed Mrs. Pritchard emerge from her house across the street, even from a distance. Her displeasure was obvious in the rigid set of her shoulders and the sharp clicks of her heels against the pavement as she marched toward the children's stand. "Excuse me," she had announced in a voice that could have cut glass, "but do you have a permit for this commercial enterprise?" Marcus had looked confused. "A what?" "A business license. Young man, you cannot simply set up shop in a residential neighborhood without proper authorization. This is a violation of our community covenants." Mrs. Johnson had appeared from the house, drawn by the commotion. "Mrs. Pritchard, they're just children selling lemonade. It's hardly a commercial enterprise." "The rules apply to everyone. Helen." Mrs. Pritchard's voice dripped with condescension. Section 14.3 of our HOA agreement clearly states that no commercial activities are permitted on residential properties without board approval. I had watched this exchange with growing irritation. My own childhood memories were filled with lemonade stands, bake sales, and other innocent ventures that taught children about work and responsibility. The idea that someone would invoke bureaucratic red tape to shut down children's creativity struck me as unnecessarily cruel. "I'll tell you what," Mrs. Johnson had said with admirable patience. "We'll make sure to get any necessary permits if they want to do this again. Today, let's just let them finish what they've started." Mrs. Pritchard's expression had soured further. "I'll be reporting this to the board. And those shutters are still the wrong color. You have 30 days to repaint them or face fines." She had turned on her heel and stalked back to her house, her white tennis outfit gleaming in the afternoon sun. I had continued my work, taking additional water samples and documenting the area for my report. But I'd kept an eye on the children, partly out of professional habit, and partly because Mrs. Pritchard's behavior had unsettled me. There was something vindictive about her demeanor that went beyond simple rule enforcement. Around 2:30, I'd been testing the pH levels of water collected from various street drains when I noticed Mrs. Pritchard leaving her house again. This time, she carried a small glass bottle in her hand, the kind used for essential oils or medicinal tinctures. She had walked quickly down the street, her movements purposeful and somehow furtive. I had lost sight of her as she rounded the corner, but something about her behavior had triggered my professional instincts. 20 years of investigating disease outbreaks and environmental contamination had taught me to recognize when someone was acting suspiciously around potential contamination sources. 20 minutes later, the children's screams had shattered the peaceful afternoon. Now, as I sealed the evidence and prepared my preliminary report, the pieces began forming a horrifying picture. I returned to my field office, a converted van, equipped with mobile testing equipment, and immediately began analyzing the lemonade samples. The first test confirmed my suspicions. The samples contained abnormally high levels of polyethylene glycol, 3350, the active ingredient in many over-the-counter laxatives. But this wasn't accidental contamination. The concentration was far too high and too evenly distributed to be anything other than deliberate adulteration. I ran additional tests, checking for other potential contaminants. What I found made my blood run cold, along with the laxative. Someone had added bisacodyl, a powerful stimulant laxative that, in high doses, could cause severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalances in children. The combination was not just cruel, It was dangerous. My hands shook as I documented the findings. In my career, I had investigated food tampering cases, but never one targeting children so young. The malicious intent was unmistakable. Someone had deliberately tried to harm 3 innocent children whose only crime was selling lemonade on a Saturday afternoon. I called the hospital first. The children were stable, but would need to remain overnight for observation. The doctors confirmed that their symptoms were consistent with laxative poisoning, and blood tests would provide additional evidence for potential criminal charges. Next, I contacted Detective Ray Morrison at the local police department. Ray and I had worked together on several environmental crime cases, and I knew he would take this seriously. Laxatives in kids' lemonade. Ray's voice was tight with anger. That's assault with a chemical weapon in my book. What's your confidence level on this? 100%. I replied. The concentrations are too high and too consistent for accidental contamination. Someone specifically targeted these children. Any suspects? I told him about Mrs. Pritchard's behavior, her confrontation with the children, and the suspicious bottle I'd seen her carrying. I can't prove anything yet, but the timing is too coincidental. She was angry about the lemonade stand, made threats about reporting the family, and then the children were poisoned. We'll need more than circumstantial evidence, Ray said, but I could hear the determination in his voice. Can you get me a complete chemical analysis? And we'll need to interview witnesses. Over the next several hours, I worked methodically to build the case. I tested the water sources in the area to rule out environmental contamination. I analyzed the children's pitcher, the cups, and even the cookies to determine the exact method of adulteration. The evidence pointed to someone adding the chemicals directly to the cups after the lemonade had been poured. By evening, I had compiled a comprehensive report that would stand up in court. The laxative concentrations were so high that a single cup could have caused serious medical complications in a child. Whoever had done this had either been incredibly reckless or genuinely malicious. I drove to the hospital to check on the children. Marcus was awake and feeling better, though still pale and tired. Amara was sleeping peacefully in the next bed, her small hand clutching a stuffed elephant her mother had brought. Jamal's parents were at his bedside, their faces etched with worry and rage. Dr. Chen. Mrs. Johnson stood up as I entered the room. Do you know what happened? The police said you found something in the lemonade. I glanced at the children, not wanting to frighten them further. Someone added chemicals to their drinks. We're investigating who might have done such a thing. Mr. Johnson, a tall man with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work, shook his head in disbelief. Who would poison children? It makes no sense. But it did make sense, in the twisted logic of someone who valued conformity and control over human decency. I had seen it before in different contexts, people who became so fixated on rules and perceived slights that they lost sight of basic morality. Detective Morrison arrived shortly after, carrying a folder that I recognized as containing the warrant he'd obtained to search Mrs. Pritchard's home. We're moving tonight, he told me quietly. The DA agrees this constitutes assault on minors with a dangerous weapon. If we find evidence linking her to the chemicals, she's looking at serious prison time. The search of Mrs. Pritchard's house took place at 8 o'clock that evening, just as the summer sun was beginning to set. I watched from my van as Ray and his team executed the warrant. Mrs. Pritchard's outraged protests, audible even from across the street. "This is harassment," she shrieked from her front porch, her perfect hair disheveled and her white outfit wrinkled. "I demand to speak to your supervisor. This is a violation of my rights." Ray's response was calm and professional. "Ma'am, We have a valid warrant to search for evidence related to the poisoning of 3 children. I strongly advise you to cooperate fully." The search didn't take long. Within an hour, the officers emerged carrying several evidence bags. Among them was a small glass bottle that appeared to match the one I had seen Mrs. Pritchard carrying earlier. Ray held up a package of over-the-counter laxatives, the same brand that contained the chemicals I had identified in the tainted lemonade. More damning still was the discovery of Mrs. Pritchard's personal journal, in which she had documented her growing frustration with the Johnson family and their flagrant disregard for community standards. The final entry, dated that very morning, contained a chilling passage. "Time to teach these people a lesson they won't forget. Some children need to learn that actions have consequences." Mrs. Pritchard was arrested at 9:15 p.m., charged with 3 counts of assault with a dangerous weapon, child endangerment, and reckless endangerment. As the police car pulled away from her perfect house with its perfect lawn and perfect conformity, neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. I spent the evening compiling my final report and preparing testimony for what would undoubtedly become a high-profile criminal case. The evidence was overwhelming chemical analysis, witness testimony, physical evidence from the search, and Mrs. Pritchard's own written confession in her journal. But the real shock came the next morning when Detective Morrison called with an update that changed everything I thought I knew about the case. "Sarah, you need to hear this." Ray's voice was grim. "We interviewed Mrs. Pritchard last night, and she broke down and confessed. But there's more. This wasn't her first time." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "She's been systematically harassing families in the neighborhood for months, maybe longer. Remember the Hendersons who moved out last winter after their daughter got mysteriously sick, and the Patels who left after their garden kept getting destroyed? It's all connected." The scope of Mrs. Pritchard's campaign of terror was staggering. Over the past 18 months, she had driven out 4 families from the neighborhood through a combination of psychological harassment, property damage, and in at least 2 cases, chemical sabotage. The Hendersons' daughter had suffered severe stomach problems after eating cookies that Mrs. Pritchard had brought to a neighborhood gathering. The family had never connected the incident to their HOA president. "She kept detailed records," Ray continued, "names, addresses, perceived violations, and plans for retaliation. It's like a blueprint for domestic terrorism." The investigation expanded rapidly. Federal authorities became involved due to the multi-jurisdictional nature of the crimes and the use of chemical weapons. I found myself working with FBI agents who specialized in hate crimes and domestic terrorism cases. What emerged was a pattern of escalating violence driven by racial animus and authoritarian control. Mrs. Pritchard's journal revealed her true motivations, filled with racist language and fantasies about creating a pure neighborhood, free of what she called undesirable elements. The Johnson family, along with the other targeted families, were predominantly Black, Hispanic, or Asian. Mrs. Pritchard had used her position as HOA president to selectively enforce rules, levy excessive fines, and create hostile environments designed to force these families to leave. The lemonade stand incident was simply the culmination of months of building hatred and frustration. When her usual tactics failed to drive out the Johnson family, she had escalated to direct violence against their children. I testified at Mrs. Pritchard's trial 6 months later, presenting the scientific evidence that proved beyond doubt that she had deliberately poisoned 3 innocent children. The courtroom was packed with members of the Maple Grove community, many of whom were learning for the first time about the systematic campaign of terror that had been conducted in their neighborhood. Mrs. Johnson's testimony was particularly powerful. She spoke about the fear her family had lived with, never knowing when the next violation notice would arrive or what new harassment they would face. She described the sleepless nights after her children were hospitalized, the guilt she felt for not protecting them, and the anger at discovering that someone they had trusted as a community leader had tried to poison her babies. "My children asked me why someone would want to hurt them," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "How do you explain to an 8-year-old that some people hate you just for existing, that they would poison your lemonade just because they don't want you in their neighborhood?" The defense tried to argue that Mrs. Pritchard suffered from mental illness, that her actions were the result of stress and breakdown rather than malicious intent. But her own journal entries contradicted this narrative, revealing careful planning and deliberate escalation over many months. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Mrs. Pritchard was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for the assault charges, plus additional time for the hate crime enhancements and the conspiracy charges related to her broader campaign of harassment. But the legal victory, satisfying as it was, represented only the beginning of the healing process for the Maple Grove community. The exposure of Mrs. Pritchard's crimes sent shockwaves through the subdivision. Many residents expressed genuine horror at what had been happening in their neighborhood, claiming they had no idea about the systematic harassment. Others, however, had suspected something was wrong, but had chosen to remain silent rather than confront the situation. A community meeting was called for the first weekend after the trial ended. I attended as both a witness to the crimes and as someone who had become invested in seeing justice done. The meeting was held in the elementary school gymnasium, packed with nearly every resident of Maple Grove. The atmosphere was tense, filled with guilt, anger, and uncertainty about how to move forward. Some residents tried to distance themselves from Mrs. Pritchard, insisting they had never supported her methods. Others admitted they had been afraid to speak up, worried about becoming her next targets. Mrs. Johnson stood to address the crowd, her dignity and grace evident even in the face of everything her family had endured. "We're not here to assign blame to every person in this room," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium. "But we are here to make sure this never happens again to any family." The community response was swift and decisive. The HOA board was completely restructured, with new leadership elected from among the residents who had actively opposed Mrs. Pritchard's policies. New oversight mechanisms were put in place to prevent any single person from wielding the kind of authoritarian power that had enabled the harassment campaign. The most meaningful changes, however, were personal and interpersonal. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other began building genuine relationships. The artificial barriers that had divided the community along racial and economic lines began to break down. A community garden was established in the space that had once been Mrs. Pritchard's pristine front lawn, her house having been sold to pay legal costs and victim restitution. The garden became a symbol of the new Maple Grove, diverse, collaborative, and genuinely welcoming. I continued to visit the neighborhood periodically as my work allowed. 6 months after the trial, I stopped by on a Saturday afternoon and found Marcus, Amara, and Jamal running another lemonade stand. This time, however, they weren't alone. Half a dozen other children from the neighborhood had joined the enterprise, their parents helping to organize what had become a weekly community event. "Dr. Chen," Marcus called out when he spotted me, "come try our new recipe. We have pink lemonade, regular lemonade, and iced tea." The transformation was remarkable. Where once there had been fear and division, there was now genuine community. Children of all backgrounds played together, while their parents chatted easily about everything from gardening tips to school fundraisers. Mrs. Johnson approached as I purchased a cup of lemonade that tasted exactly as it should: sweet, tart, and completely innocent. "How are they doing?" I asked, watching the children work together to serve their customers. "Remarkably well," she replied. "The therapy helped, and being able to tell their story in court gave them a sense of justice being done. But I think what healed them most was seeing how the community rallied around them." It was true. The children who had once been targeted for simply existing in their own neighborhood were now surrounded by friends and supporters. Their lemonade stand had become not just a business venture, but a symbol of resilience and community unity. The broader impact of the case extended far beyond Maple Grove. Mrs. Pritchard's conviction became a landmark case in the prosecution of HOA-related harassment and hate crimes. Federal guidelines were established for investigating similar cases, and training programs were developed to help law enforcement recognize the signs of systematic residential discrimination. I was invited to speak at conferences about the intersection of environmental health and civil rights, sharing the lessons learned from the lemonade stand case. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of community vigilance in protecting vulnerable residents. 1 year after the incident, the Maple Grove community organized its first annual Lemonade Festival, celebrating not just the innocence of childhood entrepreneurship, but also the strength that comes from standing together against injustice. Local businesses sponsored booths, families brought homemade treats to share, and children from across the city set up lemonade stands throughout the neighborhood. I was honored to be invited as the keynote speaker for the festival's opening ceremony, standing before hundreds of families gathered in what had once been a divided and fearful community. I reflected on the journey that had brought us all to this moment. 1 year ago, 3 children were poisoned for the crime of selling lemonade while black. I began, my voice carrying across the crowd. Today, we gather to celebrate not just their recovery, but our collective commitment to ensuring that hatred and discrimination have no place in our communities. The applause was thunderous. But what moved me most were the faces in the crowd, children of all backgrounds laughing together, parents who had found friendship across racial and cultural lines, and elderly residents who had rediscovered what community was supposed to mean. Marcus, now 9 years old, and considerably more confident than the frightened child I had first met, approached the microphone. "We want to thank everyone for making our neighborhood a place where all kids can sell lemonade safely," he said, his clear voice projecting surprising strength. "And we promise to keep making the best lemonade in the city." The crowd erupted in cheers and laughter, and I found myself wiping away tears as I watched this remarkable young boy who had survived such a terrible ordeal, now standing as a symbol of hope and resilience. As the festival continued throughout the day, I walked through the neighborhood that had been transformed so completely. The community garden flourished in what had once been Mrs. Pritchard's yard, tended by residents who had learned to work together across the lines that had once divided them. The Johnson family's house still had those cheerful yellow shutters that had once caused so much conflict. Now, however, they seemed to fit perfectly with the vibrant, welcoming atmosphere that had replaced the sterile conformity of the old HOA regime. Other houses displayed similar expressions of individuality: gardens that reflected their owner's heritage, decorations that celebrated diversity, and children's artwork that turned front yards into galleries of creativity. I stopped by the original lemonade stand location, where a small memorial garden had been planted. A simple plaque read, "In memory of innocence threatened and community reborn. May we never forget the importance of protecting our children and standing up for what is right." The memorial wasn't just about the 3 children who had been poisoned, but about all the families who had been driven away, all the dreams that had been crushed, and all the potential that had been lost to hatred and bigotry. But it was also a promise, a commitment to vigilance, to courage, and to the kind of community that protects its most vulnerable members. Detective Morrison joined me at the memorial, both of us reflecting on the case that had brought us together and the community that had emerged from its ashes. "You know what struck me most about this whole thing," he said after a long moment of silence. "What's that?" "It wasn't the poisoning itself, horrible as that was. It was how quickly things changed once people started speaking up. All those families who left, all that suffering, it could have been prevented if more people had found the courage to say something earlier." He was right. Of course. Mrs. Pritchard's campaign of terror had succeeded for as long as it did because good people had chosen silence over confrontation, comfort over courage. The transformation of Maple Grove hadn't just been about removing one bad actor. It had been about ordinary residents finding the strength to actively create the kind of community they wanted to live in. As evening approached and the festival began to wind down, I made my final rounds through the neighborhood. Children were still running between lemonade stands, their parents chatting easily as they cleaned up the day's festivities. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, a stark contrast to the tense silence that had once characterized these streets. I found myself back at the Johnson family's house, where Mrs. Johnson was helping pack up the children's lemonade stand. Marcus, Amara, and Jamal were counting their earnings with the serious concentration that only children could bring to such tasks. "How did they do today?" I asked. "Best day ever," Mrs. Johnson replied with a smile. "But more than that, they feel safe. They feel like they belong here. That's worth more than any amount of money." As I prepared to leave that evening, Marcus ran up to me with a small paper cup filled with pink lemonade. "This is for you, Dr. Chen," he said solemnly. "Thank you for keeping us safe." I accepted the cup with hands that trembled slightly, overcome by the simple gesture and everything it represented. This was why I had dedicated my career to protecting public health, why I had spent my life investigating threats to community safety. It was for moments like this when justice prevailed, when healing was possible, and when children could sell lemonade without fear. The lemonade was perfect sweet, refreshing, and absolutely free of anything that shouldn't be there. As I drove away from Maple Grove that evening, I carried with me not just the memory of 3 poisoned children and the woman who had tried to destroy them, but the far more powerful story of a community that had chosen healing over hatred, unity over division, and hope over despair. Mrs. Pritchard remained in federal prison, her appeals exhausted and her name synonymous with the kind of hatred that had once threatened to tear apart a peaceful neighborhood. But her legacy wasn't the fear she had tried to instill, or the families she had driven away. Her legacy was the strength she had inadvertently created in a community that had learned to stand together against injustice. Years later, when I told this story to other investigators, to community leaders, to parents who worried about their children's safety, I always ended with the same message: vigilance is the price of community safety. But courage is the price of justice. The children of Maple Grove had nearly paid a terrible price for one woman's hatred, but their community had paid a different price, the price of speaking up, standing together, and refusing to let evil triumph through silence. The lemonade stand incident had lasted only a few hours on a single Saturday afternoon. The healing and transformation that followed had taken months and years. But the lesson was eternal in a world where hatred and bigotry still threaten the innocent. The courage of ordinary people to do extraordinary things remains our greatest defense. And somewhere in Maple Grove, on warm Saturday afternoons, Children still set up lemonade stands, still call out to passing cars, and still dream of all the wonderful things they'll do with their earnings. The difference now is that they do so surrounded by a community that protects them, celebrates them, and ensures that the simple joy of childhood entrepreneurship remains exactly what it should be: sweet, innocent, and free from the poison of adult hatred. In the end, that may be the most important victory of all: the preservation of innocence, the protection of childhood dreams, and the promise that, in at least one corner of the world, justice and community have triumphed over hatred and fear. The children of Maple Grove had learned that there are adults who will fight for them, communities that will rally around them, and a justice system that will protect them. And in learning those lessons, they had become not just survivors, but symbols of hope for every child who has ever set up a lemonade stand and dreamed of making the world a little sweeter, one cup at a time.